Hello, and thank you for watching this lecture. My name is Dr. Shaunak Sastry. I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Cincinnati. My talk today is called The Great Unmasking, Critical Health Communication and Post-COVID Futures. Before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Mohan Katta for the opportunity. I'm very excited to share some of my experiences in the talk, and as someone who's been affiliated with CARE since its inception, it gives me great pleasure to be able to finally speak virtually, as it may be, to the audiences that follow CARE and people interested in this sort of work. So thank you, Mohan. Thank you for the opportunity, and to the lovely staff at CARE. So to give you an overview of my talk today, I have always been interested in pandemics analytically and professionally as part of my research program. But with COVID, this analytical interest also sort of translated for me, as it did for so many of us, into a personal sort of interest or immersion in it, right? And so what I'm going to do in this lecture is talk a little bit about the personal element as well. So I'm going to interweave the personal and the analytical interests in COVID response. Following that, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I mean by critical health communication, a brief overview of some key concepts, ideas that guide my thinking over the years in this area. And then I'm going to speak in more detail about prevention politics, the main meat of my talk today, politics of prevention in China's early COVID-19 response. And so that's going to be really the bulk of my talk. My work specifically focuses on the questions of masks and mask politics. And I will spend some time discussing some of my findings from my extended time doing work in China. And then as I wrap up, I'll talk a little bit about this novel coronavirus and its relationship to earlier epidemics, and how, as critical health communication scholars, we ought to think both about novelty and what we already know, and really think about the dynamic interplay of the old and the new. And then to conclude, I am going to offer some basic provocations about what masking and prevention politics will look when and if we think about the post-COVID future and the legacies of this period in the future. So that's a sort of a broad overview of my talk today. Okay, so let's begin. As I said in the previous slide, one of the things that is interesting to me professionally about COVID-19 is, besides my professional research interest in it, right? Much of my work has looked at the relationship between epidemics and social processes, and thinking about how epidemics create this sort of foment or change through which cultures and communicative processes emerge. So in today's talk, I want to share some broad work in progress ideas about one specific feature of the global response to COVID-19, which is the politics of disease prevention. I see this talk as building a bridge between my existing work, as I said, and this new, radically strange new norm that we face. And so what I'm attempting to do is build a bridge between my earlier work on HIV/AIDS in the global South, most recently in India, with the context of long-distance truck drivers, and also some of the work I've done on communication in the context of the 2014 Ebola epidemic. So while SARS-CoV-2, this virus, is new, the ways in which we conceptualize, discuss, challenge, and even panic over prevention is in a way not really new at all. Right? So to put it differently, my interest is in breaking apart the ideological, social, political, and cultural implications of this radically new moment that we find ourselves in. And in particular, my interest is in the politics of masking, mask wearing and mask as policy, which has emerged as a key sort of cornerstone of global COVID prevention. As a critical health communication scholar, and we'll get to what that means in a short minute, I'm interested in infectious disease politics in an analytical sense, but it is impossible, as I said before, to ignore the deeply personal pathways in which we encounter COVID-19, as it has changed so much about our contemporary social moment, about how we live, how we work, and so on. But for me, there is I think, a sort of a heightened way in which I have kind of experienced that, and I speak about COVID prevention and the politics of COVID prevention through that lens. As an Indian scholar who divides most of his time between the United States of America, where I live and work, and China, where my family, my spouse's family lives, I have some sort of vantage point, at least a unique perspective to offer in thinking about what what transformation COVID has had, right? And the fact that personally, I have traveled and lived in the US, in India, and in China through the period of this epidemic since January 2020, offers me if some sort of vantage point, statistical. I'm a statistical minority who's done that, if not sort of theoretical, right? So for the rest of this talk, I will try to interweave my personal analytical analysis with excerpts from my experience living in China through the lockdowns and observing and doing ethnographic fieldwork through this period. So here, to start us off, here's one quick tidbit, an autobiographical tidbit, if you may. On January 2nd, 2020, the US White House received its first intelligence briefing about a potential pneumonic condition that had erupted in central China. Word spread that there were at that point nearly 150 cases across the country. The origin of this was uncertain. There was a lot that was unknown, but the potential for disruption was clearly present. As it so happens, in sort of irony or hindsight, you may call it, on January 2nd, the same day, I happened to leave the US to head to China, to head to Beijing for a fellowship at a university in Beijing as part of my sabbatical. Long story short, 3 months down the line, canceled fellowships, plans dramatically changed, and I spent 3 months in a living room in my in-laws' house in Nanjing, and just sort of was observing these dramatic changes kind of take place, not just in China, but also in Italy, in India, in US, sort of just thinking about these chains of transmission. And that personal kind of narrative and that personal experience of it has informed how I have started thinking about the politics of COVID prevention, right? So if you see on the slide up there, that's one example of this, how COVID has sort of colonized our personal spaces, right? That's my 5-year-old's rendition of how the coronavirus attacks our blood cells. So to do critical health communication and to study it in this moment also means, for me at least, this interweaving of the academic, political, and the personal, and the ways in which we navigate that. So as far as I am concerned, and the way I think of this area of research called critical health communication, to be a critical health comm scholar means, to me, to be invested in the critique of public communication around health, which is another way of saying that so much of what we do, how we act, what we believe, and what we resist in the name of health has these deep, uncertain, murky roots in who we are as people. You know, the forces that shape us to become who we are, the stories that we tell about ourselves and to each other. To be a critical health comm scholar to be interested in critical health communication, the critique of how we come to make those assumptions or have those beliefs or resist certain kind of ideas. Critical health communication is interested in uncovering the ideological or cultural or social roots of these sort of deep standing assumptions or beliefs that we have about ourselves, about our bodies, um, about society, right? And so the title of my talk today, right, the Great Unmasking, speaks to this, right? So on the one hand, COVID-19 has made masks an everyday commodity, right? We all engage in producing them, buying them, trying to score them on Amazon, what have you. But like so many infectious diseases that came before it, even though masks are new, COVID-19 has unmasked something crucially important about ourselves, about society, some fundamental, unquestioned, or perhaps ignored assumptions about what it means to live in a globalized, highly interdependent, networked form of late capitalist modernity, where we take our ecological fragility for granted, where we sort of continuously participate in this kind of closed loop of infinite growth on a finite planet, right? So there is something that COVID says about us, and I don't mean this in a poetic sense, I mean that in an analytical sense, right? So to do critical health communication is to be interested in uncovering the social, ideological, political basis of health. Why is it that people act in certain ways? What are the ideological motivations? How does our talk about health, how does available public communication about health make apparent the whys of certain assumptions, certain unquestioned assumptions about our health, right? So why is it that calling something a China virus or a Wuhan virus? Why is it that those sort of appellations or labels take root? Why are they politicized, right? So an interesting thing that I observed while living in China was that in the midst of all this sort of politicking about the China virus, right, the Trump administration's insistence on calling this a China virus, in China, this was often referred to as the Wuhan virus, right? So there's always this sort of othering. There's sort of this level where you place responsibility or place blame or place the control over this glorious uncertainty somewhere else, right? So that's kind of what I think fundamentally critical health communication is interested in, to make apparent the whys. Why do some things happen? And just as a disclaimer before I proceed, to do critical health communication also implies thinking about communication as constitution and contestation rather than transmission. And I know that's a lot of sort of jargony words to put together, but what that basically means is that my goal here is not prescriptive. There is excellent work being done in terms of thinking about what messages work, right? Like how can we design communication to make people wear masks or accept scientific reality or accept the existing medical evidence. And there is work, there is communication scholarship that is interested in testing messages, in message design, in campaign design, in evaluation. Critical health communication is primarily interested in critique, in thinking about why at a sociological, at a global level, right? So we think about communication not as transmission, as the crafting and interpreting of messages, but the fundamental process of meaning making. How do people make meanings around health, and what discourses, what institutional, governmental, social, cultural, corporate influences shape those meanings? Who decides how we come to consensus around health? So that's just sort of a broad disclaimer about what critical health communication is. over the last 10 years or so, in my academic trajectory, I've thought a lot about critical health and the ideological roots of health in the context of pandemics, right? So um, if you look at my previous work, I have sort of talked about HIV and how to think about HIV epidemics in the global South in the context of critical theory and some of the ideas behind in critical theory. So what I want to do now is go through just a very rough laundry list of some fundamental ideas or fundamental theoretical hooks, and these are not linear or continuous in any sense, but they offer a way to think about what critical theory might look like in a pandemic, right? So when we think about critical health communication and its role in understanding pandemics, we kind of you begin with the idea or with the acknowledgement that pandemics are periods of what I call semiotic excess, right? That during a pandemic there is great societal churn, there is great foment and dynamism about very fundamental meaning making processes, how we understand ideas about. I mean, in the case of HIV, about intimacy, about fidelity, about abstinence, about trust. And similarly, in COVID, about insider, outsider, who do we trust? What surfaces are clear, are safe, what are not? So there is a lot of sort of uncertain and foment in that kind of describes this period, and and much of what we take for granted, that we assume, that we don't even give a second thought about, changes dramatically in a pandemic, right? It's something as quotidian and banal as air travel, right, becomes suddenly difficult and challenging, and the very nature of how we make meaning in our society changes. And it is in the spirit of this meaning making process that Paula Treichler, this influential scholar, talked about the dual epidemics of HIV/AIDS, and she was writing in the context of HIV. She talked about the biomedical epidemic, right? The fact that disease transmits from one body to the other through droplets, through bodily fluids, through the air, through water. So there is one level of epidemic that is biomedical, that is biological. But there's the other, and for Treichler and many others in her wake, the more challenging pandemic, or the more challenging aspect of epidemics, was the epidemic of signification, of meaning making, as to how do ideas circulate, right? The WHO for the first time earlier this year indexed the COVID-19 as an infodemic, with the idea that there was a lot of unverified or fake information about the epidemic that was circulating on the online social media sites, and sort of just we were surrounded by bad information. But this has kind of always been the case, and the argument that I'm increasingly want to make is that yes, COVID is infodemic in the sense that with unrestrained access to social media, the volume of bad information dwarfs credible information. But epidemics have always been this, right? That rumor, gossip, fake news have always been the currency of communication during an epidemic. So how the epidemic of meaning making is as dangerous or compounds the danger of the biomedical epidemic. And to add to this, and I think historically there is another dimension of thinking about pandemics critically, is the baggage of what is called tropical medicine, or the history of relationships between the West, the colonial West, and bodies in the global South, right? It is not an exaggeration to say that the history of population surveillance and public health and epidemiology coincided very squarely with that of colonial governance, right? Public health emerged in some way. What we today call modern public health emerged as a site of control of native bodies, right, with the anxiety of colonial administrations about unruly, uncertain, sick bodies in the global south. So there is this history of the quote unquote white man's burden, as it shows on the slide right now, has always kind of been this background to understanding and critiquing how meanings circulate in pandemics. Today, though, the situation is different, right? While the ghosts of colonial medicine and tropical medicine still haunt much policy making in emerging disease management, an additional challenge today is the threat of the global versus the importance of the local, right? So this global-local dialectic in public health management continues to be a fundamental fault line, in thinking about epidemic management. So, for example, for a disease like Ebola, it is the global threat of contagion to the West, in the US and in Europe, that was more pressing than the local casualties or the local impact of the disease. And so managing that dialectic is really a challenge as to how much of this is a local threat, how much of this is global, right? Similarly, scholars like Sheldon Unger and Niranjan Karnik have written about what happens when we all live a plane ride away from contagion, right? This idea that disease categories will be globalized. Super spreaders can now go from Wuhan to Shanghai to Beijing and then to Auckland or to Washington DC potentially, and so that kind of epidemics challenge existing ideas around globalization, and with those challenging also emerges the notion of moral panic. And moral panic, as Sheldon Unger has written about, moral panic is the idea that there is a degree of affective or emotional paranoia about disease that transcends the biological fear of contagion, and we've seen that with COVID. That has clearly been the case, right? And finally, I think a last concept to kind of tie all these together, and this is more recent. Priscilla Wald has this fantastic book called has a fantastic book called Contagious, where she talks about this notion of the outbreak narrative, as that infectious disease outbreaks have a particular kind of story attached to them, and they tell a certain kind of self-bounded story: who the hero is, who the villain is, who are the actors, who are change agents, what is the crisis, and what is the resolution. So that narrative kind of plays, and we can see that in the context of COVID, certainly about assigning blame or assigning responsibility. So to think about critical health communication during a pandemic and to theorize during this time, this is kind of the reservoir of conceptual language that I'm sort of looking at broadly. So, as I said before, in this talk, my objective is to combine personal reflection and a review of relevant literature to analyze the politicization of personal protection in China's early response to the COVID epidemic. And I want to be clear what I mean by politicization here. And I'm going to spend the first few minutes in the next few slides talking about what I mean by this politics, right? This is not just a refusal to wear a mask, but I think of politics more fundamentally. And so to think about prevention politics, and as I was debating about how best to talk about it, my mind rushed back to this widely circulated GIF that I saw on the Chinese social media. So my goal is to offer a critical analysis of COVID-19 prevention and to locate these prevention politics within a global historical cultural context, right? So back in February, as the first reports of a total lockdown in Italy emerged, right? There was, at this point, China was already under lockdown. Large parts of the country were under lockdown. Wuhan, the city, was sealed. sealed off. All residents were locked inside, and there was news in the media that the entire region of Lombardy in Italy would be sealed off because of the reports of COVID positive cases among the population. And so, as the reports of the total lockdown in Italy were leaked to the media, there was this interesting meme or GIF that was circulating on Chinese social media that kind of spoke to the idea of prevention politics. Right? It said something to and this is my translation, that says, with quarantine, no human rights, no quarantine, no human left. And so it kind of spoke to this idea at that time, this debate between what the stakes were, or how, on the one hand, how recent this was 7 months ago, but it seems like a lifetime ago when we were debating whether asking people to be locked down, to be quarantined, was against the fundamental liberal democratic welfare state, right? Versus sort of this Wuhan model of like hunkering down, sealing the city. And so prevention politics really is interested, or the way I think about it is to think about how does the logic of infectious disease prevention rest on a bedrock of pre-existing bifurcations or categories between the West and the East, between human rights and no human rights, right? There is this sense in which we have moved so quickly, and so much has changed in the last 6 months. I mean, just in New Zealand, from last week, when the new rounds of lockdowns were announced, when the new cluster of patients were identified, it goes to show how much of that terrain has moved since then, right? So that's kind of what I mean by prevention politics, right? For those of you who remember back in China in February and January, when these debates were going on in the Western world, in many in European countries, of whether lockdowns were even feasible or legal or ethical or permissible. At the same time, in the city of Wuhan, there was this complete sealing off and this lockdown and mass censorship of the personal accounts of patients, citizens, health providers from Wuhan, right? And so, just to refresh memory, the threat and the impending threat of COVID-19 only made it out into the public, at least in the initial context, due to the whistleblowing work of Li Wenliang, the physician whose picture you see on the slide, who sort of went against the sort of status quo and started making personal microblogs about just how deadly and the fact that there was human-to-human transmission of COVID-19. At that point, when in considering Western media's coverage of Li Wenliang and of how so-called authoritarian public health approaches were sort of policing bodies, there was this dichotomy between that approach and an open Western transparent approach to public health. And we've seen that this dichotomy has sort of eroded since that, right? There is no longer, or at least what COVID has done has that line has sort of been eroded dramatically, where we don't see lockdowns as being antithetical, or at least we've been asked to create an exception where there is the greater social good, even in Western democratic liberal states, is operated through the action of the lockdown, right? And this is very clear in the context of India, and what we've seen in India is this disruption of what so-called welfare state public health response looks like. So in India, the draconian lockdown that lasted for at the highest level for about 3.5 4 months and still continues in areas really shows how the impact of this epidemic on the most marginalized and the most vulnerable section of society, right? Migrant workers, domestic workers, who were in some ways brutalized by the state, by actors of the state, right? And finally, I think what is interesting in the background of thinking about lockdowns and oppositions to kind of lockdowns is just to reflect about how much of the opposition to enforced social distancing initially was philosophical, right? Was in the realm of whether this is ethical or philosophically congruent with liberalism, and to today where that division is just economic, right? Can the economy survive it? And so when we think about lockdown politics and we think about critical public health, this how quickly that the terrain shifts is interesting to think about. So moving on now to kind of the core argument that I want to make in the context of my talk today is this idea of mask politics, right? If you were to follow US media, and in the US, where being the global epicenter of the disease, so much of mass politics today surrounds the idea of non-use, right? The idea of people who don't use masks, and there's the editorials in the New York Times that call this moment a culture war. There is a politicization of masks as non-use. Rather than focus on that singular aberration in the US, my talk today really wants to kind of flip that around and think about the politics of mask use. So on the screen today now, you see a video playing that defines or describes ideal mask use in China. This video was circulated among the business communities and in the general public in late January, and talked about how businesses were supposed to reopen in the wake of the epidemic in Wuhan. Here are the protocols. You come into work with one mask, you discard it, you sanitize, you wear a new mask, you go in, you have your temperature checked, right? The point that I'm trying to make with this short clip is it's not that refusal to use masks is a political act. Well, yes, it is in the most banal sense of the term. But what is more interesting is that mask use itself is highly political, or it creates certain kind of political configurations, and that is really of interest to me, sort of personally, right? And so, if you think about mask wearing, and here's how I want to kind of move from this moment. I want to kind of create a dichotomy or a difference between mask wearing as behavior and masking policy, right? So I remember when I was in China, when I saw that video, and that video was circulated in on so many social media networks. And there was this kind of aspirational, here is the gold standard. You wear one mask, you change it, you dispose it. At that time, masks were severely short in terms of access. So there was no public access to masks in China at that time. So there was this weird contradiction between what the state mandates you to do and what one can actually do, right? So I remember being in China, trying desperately to get masks from friends in the US, from my family in India. I had bought a small stack from before I had left India like a month ago, and those were fast running out, and we had no access to masks, and so no access to grocery stores and no access to the public. So there is this. So in long story short, mask wearing creates a political reality as much as the lack of or the choice, quote unquote, of not wearing masks does. And so I want to kind of tease that out a bit further. So if you think about mask wearing as an individual behavior that mitigates social risk, right? It's a call upon an individual who acts in her best interest to mitigate personal and social risk. But when you think of mask wearing, you also, as I made clear in my example, you need to think about masks as commodities, right? So these are not immediately available. These have to be produced, procured, made, distributed, supplied. And these issues of mask distribution, of production, were of crucial importance in the early part of the epidemic. And they continue to be in the US and in other parts of the globe, right? Whether you buy a surgical mask or an N95 mask, or whether you make your own, masks are not just ideations, they are also commodities that circulate in a particular kind of economy of production, consumption, and waste. More importantly, I think mask wearing is also related to a certain kind of symbolic dimension, right? That they are fundamentally linked to identity, as we see in the US, where there are issues about, or there are social sort of concerns about whether you should be seen wearing a mask. They are linked to who you are. They produce a certain kind of cultural ritual. They are linked to disease stigma, and they are, of course, a very fundamental way of medicalizing the disease, right? Like you see a person wearing a mask, and you are immediately thinking about disease and disease prevention. So in that sense, the masks are highly symbolic. They bring to attention in their presence. They are not just biomedical commodities, but they're also particular symbols. And finally, the mask wearing also involves a practice, right? It is linked to compliance. It is linked to rules about where one should wear a mask, where one does not wear a mask. It is linked to what kind of mask one wears. And I remember that as the epidemic progressed in China, there was this sort of great online debate about what kind of masks is one should wear. Do you wear the mask with the valve that protects you but doesn't protect others? Do you wear N95? Do you save it for medical professionals, as the case has been in the US, in India, where there's this sentiment about saving these scarce resources for people who need it the most, right? So mask wearing as a behavior sort of involves all of these kind of dimensions. It's a behavior, it's a commodity, it's a symbol, it's also a practice. I distinguish this from masking policy, and I think that the difference is worth attending to. Mask policy masking policy is a political action, right? It requires a certain kind of political consensus, a political will to mitigate social risk. But more importantly, and I think this is the kind of idea that I'm working through in my current work, it is also at its core a transaction, right? A mask mandate is also in some way a transfer of risk management to the individual actor from the state or from the institution. It says that the last point of prevention is the individual. So that masking also, as policy, kind of outlines this relationship between the state and the individual. It requires, as we've seen around the world, this imagined social contract, right? That we are, quote unquote, all hashtag in this together. That it requires an imagination of working towards a global or a common good, which we've seen sort of this ideal kind of breaks down at interesting moments, and that why it breaks down and in what are the situations where it inheres, where people actually do feel, or communities actually act in ways that protect themselves and their peers and their neighbors. That difference is worth kind of teasing out. As practice, when you think about mask policy as practice, it also hinges on, or it creates these conditional access to social resources, right? So, for example, access to governmental buildings, access to social services, access to food pantries, all sort of channeled through the idea of mass compliance, that you have to be a compliant subject in order to access these sort of conditions that are exacerbated by the epidemic. And finally, and I think this is the interesting aspect of mask policy. It also creates identity forms, right? As a collective. So in China, there is this refrain, right? Now that Megoran, like they don't, Americans don't mask, quote unquote. This sort of really stereotypical or basic idea that now gains currency in that context. And I think what is interesting about masking policy as when you think about it in terms of identity is it allows for a certain kind of compliance, as I talk about in the next couple of slides. So what I'm going to do now, having distinguished these two dimensions, mask wearing and policy, is talk about a spectrum of mask politics, right? And so these are ideas that I haven't crystallized in any finalized form yet. But what I want to do is kind of show you a spectrum of political possibilities or imaginations in terms of what happens when masking is taken up as a practice or as a policy, and what are the implications of this at individual, collective, and political levels, right? So it's really a spectrum from coercion to consent. And this is what I want to present next. And again, these are not in any ways finalized. These are sort of dynamic and not in any ways binding or fixed in time. So what if you see on the slide, I offer a range of different political imaginaries that emerge as a consequence of mask wearing, right? So, and these are not chronological, but there is some degree of sort of evolution through them. So initially when the city of Wuhan was sealed and there was this nationwide lockdown in China. Now this is like Chinese New Year weekend, right? So early January in 2020. There was this mandatory nationwide mask wearing, which was enforced, access to all sort of public services, access to the hospitals, access to transportation, access to grocery stores, all required a pretty rigorous screening process, which included temperature checks and masking. So in public spaces, initially, this masking was mandatory. And yet, as I said earlier, there's this contradiction where there were no masks to be bought. You couldn't find one there online or in person. The only masks that were available at that point, at least in the city that we were living in, were rationed by the government. So there were these long queues for masks with a daily quota. And from there, from that coercive, you have to mask and you have to wear a mask, not a face covering, quote unquote. From there, as production even as production was lagging the demand, there was an emergence towards, or there was a movement towards compliance, right? That there is this universal compliance with masking in 15 days or 2 weeks after this policy was unrolled. And in some sense, yes, it makes sense, right? There's this historical baggage of SARS and the miscommunication of the government in that context, and so mask wearing was pretty near universal. And as production caught up in the next few months, you saw that compliance was almost like 100%, right? So even when masks were not available in January, when we were desperately attempting to procure masks from outside, by April, China was exporting masks as some sort of diplomacy, right? So compliance. And what is interesting here, I think one of the broad macro implications of mass politics was this notion of the private and the public, the intersection between the state and private corporations. So massive state subsidies were offered for private entities that would produce masks, and almost every mass producer in China at that point was not originally in that business, right? So there was this massive pivoting in private industry into PPE production, and that was kind of subsidized by the state, right? So here, private capital became this tool of enacting state policy. But even as this happened, there's also a creation of what I call a ritual community, right? So there was these ritual communities around mask wearing. For example, there was like really very widely circulated posts and videos and pictures of frontline workers showing mask scars, right? Like the what happens when you wear masks for a 24-hour period. And so this heroism and the analogy to being at the forefront of the war. So there was really this creation of this imagined community through the frontline workers, right? That became a pretty strong rhetoric for why you would comply with mask use mandates, right? Another aspect of mass politics that I thought was interesting is as masks become social currency, right? So as this policy is enforced and people are sort of really hustling to get access to masks, you see there's that mask, the actual commodity gains a certain kind of social currency, right? So people exchange it as New Year gifts. There are jokes about paying someone in masks. They are linked very clearly to businesses opening, as I showed earlier, and so they achieve in the marketplace a certain kind of discursive but also material currency, right? They become valuable in that sense. But as the virus or as the epidemic progressed, and there was a sense that it was brought under control, quote unquote, masks also become a certain kind of courtesy, right? So I remember I call it in the slide protective versus fatic use of masks. So there is this sense of where mask protects you, but there's also a sort of courtesy where you see someone come into the elevator and you kind of hurry and put a mask on, or you're trying to get an Uber and you wear a mask until you see the car pull up. This sort of a kind of creation of this public and private dimension that exists based on this imagined collective, right? This courtesy. And so there, in that case, the mask is not strictly protective, right? Because it's not you don't wear it all the time, but it has a certain kind of imagined fatic kind of views. Like I'm respecting you enough to do it, or I acknowledge that I am a compliant citizen as much as you are. One of the strongest drivers of this mass politics, I think, as the epidemic soared in the US, was this proxy for citizenship, where masks really become a way in which to assert sort of this muscular nationalism. And I think that's the real interesting, gritty aspect of mask politics in China that we've really not thought yet about how it became not just a way to protect at the individual level and to kind of, forget the embarrassment of SARS and of the early response, but it also became a very strong, muscular symbol for Chinese nationalism that was sort of not all that America was not, right? So there is this kind of really easily available heuristic through which you can kind of create this identity of this muscular China, right? So it becomes the proxy for health citizenship and for muscular nationalism, as I said. Reading Western media depictions of mask use in China, one is often tempted to believe, or that people actually assume that this level of compliance that comes from coercion, right? These are just people who are compliant to the state, who are not programmed against so-called tyrannical governments as we see in the US. But I think there is a level of deconstruction. There's a level of breaking this, sort of going below the surface to think about the history of SARS and the initial sort of lack of transparent crisis communication and what that does to individuals, right? So mask use from an individual Chinese citizen the perspective of a layperson is not just compliance, but it's also individual protection against a non-trusting source, right? So it becomes in some ways a way to safeguard against to bring control back to the individual, right? And then finally, and I think through these kind of circles, you see today this sort of generalized social agreement or this consensus about the value or the utility of masks. That is informed, as I said, by the history of SARS, the SARS epidemic, but also the comparative caseloads of China versus the West. Right. So there is this sense in which there's now today you see this societal consensus, and rather than assume that this preceded the mask mandates, I think the interesting thing about mask is precisely how this consensus was achieved. In many ways through coercion, in many ways through sort of hegemonic understanding of muscular nationalism, so on and so forth, right? So on the one hand, you see a lot of these new discourses of masking being sort of this, a response to this radical newness of COVID. But I think also as a scholar who has studied HIV, right, I'm the more I read about mask discourses, the more I am drawn to the idea that the coronavirus is novel, and has created a new register for prevention, right? It has created these new terms, these new vocabularies, but the politics of epidemic prevention seem to follow really well-worn practices, right? That hasn't changed. So masks are only used in specific public situations, right? But if you compare them, for example, to the history of condom use, for example, and how the consensus around what is called CCU, or correct and consistent use of condoms, emerged as the gold standard for HIV prevention, you see the similarities. There's a real overlap, right, in terms of moral panic, in terms of the idea of religious exemption, the threats to children, how to talk about masks and education, to sort of how they colonize the normal everyday, right? So the parallels are hard to miss if you are kind of historically minded, right? Now, granted, masks are used in public situations. Condom use is sort of the private domain, but they both sort of both masks in the context of COVID and condom use in the context of HIV challenge this public-private dimensions that we see, where you mask in public, don't mask in private. You wear condoms in private, but only with certain kind of outsiders. So there is this sort of inside-outside dynamic that is worth kind of deconstructing and requires more attention. Overall, though, I think the sort of broad takeaway from a critical perspective is that so much of masking discourse is new, but we've seen this before. We've seen it, right? The critical scholars must kind of ought to recognize that this moment has we've seen this in the decades-long activism around HIV, around safe sex, around testing. So in that sense, to have a critical response to COVID-19 also means to be historically minded about it. So to wrap up, then I want to just offer a few brief comments about what masks or what masking will look like as the epidemic kind of progresses, and we see, models that say that our next 2 or 3 years will be sort of an on and off kind of pattern. In the context of China, as the number of COVID cases recede, the typical blue surgical mask is no longer quotidian in everyday life, right? You don't see it all the time. Just yesterday, the striking image of thousands of maskless Wuhan residents at a pool party at a pool in Wuhan sort of were published around the globe, and there was this kind of dread and fear about no masks. In the US and India, of course, the situation is very different. The virus continues to escalate with tens of thousands of new cases every day. I think what is interesting to think about is the question of production and distribution, right? The production, distribution, and circulation of these perishable, paper-thin, but not insignificant commodities, they offer a peek into the alternative possibilities to current configurations of market-led globalization, right? Whether this alternative was the turn to artisanal production, cloth masks, the re-emergence of like tailoring and doing it yourself, or in the case of sort of multilateralism that kind of went against the grain of this of competitive advantage that was at the heart of neoliberal globalization, where we think of the global economy and not as discrete elements. So as we think about what masks will, or what masking will look like, and the implications, or how mass politics will inhere even after COVID, I'd like to end with thinking about, or offering this idea that if we compare how, say, condom stigma or PrEP stigma in the context of HIV has sort of dwindled and has created these subjectivities that are sort of activist subjectivities around prevention, that we might see similar futures for these commodities that are at once very banal, very everyday, but are imbued with symbolical and political meaning. That's kind of all I have. I want to thank you for your time and for listening. And if you have questions, please feel free to email me at my institution email address, and I would love to answer and chat more. Thank you.